I think a lot of people tend to think of the sophistication point like it's a unicorn point and that it's subjective. And to an extent, those things are true. But I think that there are certain mental models you can use to help you get the sophistication point a lot easier. And I think the main idea of this video is that I think the sophistication point is just a matter of forming connections. And I want to help you find that as well. So this is the College Board's rubric. You can find it online. It's a PDF for free. I'm going to just skip past it because I have it summarized here. But if you want to read it, go ahead and pause. So my summary basically of it is that let's start with all types of essays. So across all types of essays, you need to examine the complexities, tensions, and write vividly and persuasively. And we're going to focus on those first two. So what are complexities and tensions? So I think a hint of this comes in the fact that they say that in synthesis, the complexities and tensions are across the sources, right? So tensions across the sources, for example, if we look at this from a synthesis lens, we can see, okay, some of these sources are going to contradict each other. Some of the parts of the evidence are going to contradict each other, right? So really, tension is just being able to resolve and understand multiple viewpoints. And that's the same with complexity. Just understanding that it's not only your point of view is not the only one, right? It's a lot more gray than most people argue. And a way to help that kind of highlight that is by qualifying your thesis statement, right? And we'll talk about that more later. But the general idea we have to get from this first part, complexity and tension, is that you should never only be looking at solely your viewpoint and treating it like it's the only correct one. You need to examine other people's viewpoints. So a lot of times that's in the form of counter arguments. You need to examine the evidence, right? Don't just take it blindly. Look at the speaker, the audience, the rhetorical situation. That's what we're going to talk about as well. So when we look at the synthesis and argument more specifically, right, these are basically, you're going to be taking a side more so than the rhetorical analysis, which is more so an analysis piece. So because of that, in the synthesis and argument, you have to think about the implications and the limitations of arguments specifically. So one thing College Board notes is that this is especially in the broader context, right, the implications and limitations of arguments. And I think that helps give us a hint as to why I'm saying make connections to the context, right? So the limitations of arguments can be highlighted by connecting pieces of evidence together, right? The implications of arguments can be given by providing a context of the argument, providing effects of the argument, right? Stuff like that. And we're going to talk about that further. But really, it's kind of a similar mindset to complexities and tensions, where it's like you shouldn't just be looking at each thing in isolation, right? Your evidence should not be in isolation. Your arguments, none of the arguments should be in isolation, right? You need to look at all of the evidence and arguments in respect to each other, if it's a synthesis essay, or if it's an argument essay, you need to look at it in respect to potentially other pieces of evidence you may use, like by yourself, or potentially the broader context in the sense of other events that are going on, or other places, times, current events, stuff like that. And finally, for the rhetorical analysis, using the rhetorical situation, that is also the context, right? Because the rhetorical situation, we're going to delve into this more in our slides that follow this, but it's basically just the context of the author's text, right? So you're basically being able to say, okay, how does the speaker's identity or the audience identity or the purpose, stuff like that, how does that influence their choices? Anyways, all of that is to say, we're going to get into that later, but the general idea that you need to take away from the rubric is that College Board really wants you to look at your argument from multiple viewpoints. They really want you to look at the broader context. And I've summarized that by saying make connections, right? Make connections between your argument and other arguments, right? Make connections between between a piece of evidence you choose and another piece of evidence, and the source and the argument, right? make connections to current events, make connections to all this other stuff. And that's going to help make your writing more full, right? It's going to help make your evidence not feel like you're just saying, okay, here's my first point, here's my second point, here's my third point, right? It's doing it very rote. The goal with sophistication is to hopefully make your evidence feel like it's connected to a broader, not theme, but like the argument isn't just evidence, 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 like in quick succession. The pieces of evidence are connected, and those connections are in turn connected to this broader like whole that this broader context that you can't really take away from an argument, because all arguments are built in a context, right? So they want you to analyze that as well as the text. So two things I haven't mentioned. Sorry, I'm going to move on after a bit, but I just want to go through this thoroughly. I haven't mentioned the making effective rhetorical choices and writing vividly and persuasively, because those deal with your writing style, okay? So this is part of why I said the sophistication point is subjective, right? Because what constitutes vivid writing and persuasive writing and an effective rhetorical choice is very much up to the reader, right? Very much up to how they interpret effective and vivid and persuasive. So you don't want to rely on that, but you can try to do it, right? If you want to, if your teacher gives you like practice essays, right, frequently, I would recommend trying to include like a rhetorical choice that you learned about for rhetorical analysis. I'd try adding that in there. That's an effective rhetorical choice, because fundamentally you're trying to write a persuasive argument, right? So you can make rhetorical choices, use rhetoric, and that will help you write more vividly and persuasively. Outside of rhetorical choices, I guess another thing I'd recommend, vary your sentence length, right? Sort of the same thing with the rhetorical choices, right? Like, use long and short sentences for flow and effect, the kind of thing you'd analyze in rhetorical analysis. And finally, also use varied punctuation, right? Semicolons, colons, em dashes. However, my kind of caveat to all this is that don't force it, right? If you can't do it on the exam, if you can't do it like later in the year, don't sweat it, right? The more important thing is that the content of your essay is good. That's your first step. You need to make sure your evidence and your reasoning is good. And then you can focus, okay, am I analyzing the broader context? Am I making connections between pieces of evidence? Am I looking at the rhetorical situation? That's your sophistication. And then if you've gotten all that mastered, then if you have time at the end of the year, maybe you can try to make your writing like a bit more vivid. But truly, your focus should be on the meat of your essay. That's enough of my yapping, though. We're going to go into this kind of model for it that I really like. It starts with the text itself and then goes out to the immediate context and the broader context. And the way it works is this is kind of applicable to all the types of essays, but certain levels are going to be applicable to some certain types of essays that more than others. So, for example, the synthesis, a really good way to get sophistication in synthesis is to focus on this first inner circle, the text. Limitations, combinations, counter arguments, right? This is where you're going to make connections within the text, right? So for a synthesis, that means looking at different pieces of evidence and seeing how they connect, right? Is that like a good connection? Does that help your argument? Does it hurt your argument? How can you resolve that, right? Remember that fundamentally for all the essays, every single word is purposefully chosen, right? They take like a year, I think, to make these exams. So they really do look it over and make sure that all of the words are chosen on purpose. So use that to your advantage. Know that they're giving you the author's identity for a reason, right? They're giving you the context of the situation for a reason. And for the text part, they're giving you descriptions and they're choosing each source specifically, right? Now, in the immediate context, this is the rhetorical situation. We're going to talk about this on the slides, but it's basically the context of the work, right? So, like, it's basically explaining, like, who the speaker is and who the audience is and, like, the exigence and all that stuff that went into the making of the work consciously or unconsciously. that helps inform the sort of choices that are used and the sort of arguments that are made. Now, finally, we have the broader context. This is part of the rhetorical situation. This rhetorical situation is context, but this is, more broadly speaking, the larger outside evidence and the impacts and stuff. And I don't have a star next to it because I truly don't believe you necessarily need outside evidence. It's definitely good to have if you can, but it's definitely not necessary to get sophistication. I think that if you analyze the evidence well enough and you make connections between pieces of evidence, and you try to analyze the situation, you try to analyze the audience and the author and maybe some of the context of the work that that College Board gives you, that's usually enough for sophistication. Now, let's move in specifically. Let's just hone in on this text part, okay? So, counter arguments to me is the first thing that jumps to mind, right? So, synthesis, super easy to do counter arguments because they give you all the sources, right? You don't have to think of the counter arguments yourself because they give you the counter arguments. So when you're writing on your paper, right, describing each piece of evidence, make sure you very purposefully make connections between the pieces. Like, you can draw arrows if you want to, say this counters this counters that, right? Make sure you know why, right? That's really how you can get good evidence and sophistication too. The way I've heard it described is that your sources should be in conversation with one another, right? I think this is a really good way of putting it. None of your evidence should just be in isolation because they give you all 7 sources for a reason. That's not to say you need all the sources they give you, but you should try to engage if you want sophistication. I think it's a good idea to engage with the other side, right? With evidence that doesn't necessarily agree with you. And before I move on to the second bullet point, I want to kind of take a moment to distinguish, I think, 2 types of counter arguments, where one is specific to evidence, right? Where it's this evidence is directly contradicted by something else they say, or it's, I guess, challenged, or it doesn't happen in a specific case because another piece of evidence covers a specific case, something like that. Essentially, your counter argument is to one part of your line of reasoning, okay? And that is when I think you should try to integrate your counter argument into your evidence. I generally try to do that. I try to integrate my counter argument evidence into my body paragraphs rather than having a separate body paragraph, because that's just a personal choice of mine. I find that helps it flow better, and I think helps the reader find the connection to the counter argument better than if you just plop that evidence later in a paragraph and they're going to have to remember your previous evidence. However, that's not to say you can't have a counter argument paragraph. I think that definitely can work well if you're just countering your thesis as a whole, doing a bigger claim. Or alternatively, if you qualify your thesis, which is I'm talking about in the second bullet point in the John Irish thesis formula, if you say your qualification, if you say your counter argument in your claim, for example, a specific case where your claim isn't true, then I think it's very valid to bring it up in a separate paragraph, because then that's a specific focus, right? So it all kind of depends on the scale of the counter argument you're doing. But the bottom line is, no matter the scale, it's very helpful to do counter arguments in order to help get sophistication. And I think the last thing I'm going to say on this is definitely don't just leave it there. Don't just say, okay, there's this counter argument and that's it. Don't just explain it. You have to reconcile it, right? Because it's not enough just to plop it there and say, oh, I know that there's a counter argument, right? Because of course there is, right? The sophistication part is when you're able to reconcile those 2 points. You're able to qualify your claim, or you're able to add logical reasoning to help explain why your claim is true to a greater extent than the counter argument. But definitely don't just say, okay, this is a counter argument and that's it, right? You have to explain, okay, why are you then, if there's a counter argument, why are you picking your original thesis? Why did you set it out instead of siding with the counter argument, right? Now, let's go to the opposite, right? Combinations. This is when you combine multiple pieces of evidence to help strengthen them, right? This is very prevalent in the rhetorical analysis, right? This isn't necessarily sophistication, but it's very much necessary to connect multiple rhetorical choices in order to get that for in evidence. That's literally one of the specifications on the rubric. But I think connecting multiple rhetorical choices really helps you see the rhetorical situation, which we're going to talk about later, and like understand why the author is making these choices, because that connection, that common point, is kind of the common thing that the author's trying to set up, right? For example, if your author's talking a lot about like nature and they're using a lot of nature imagery, and then they're also like slowing the pace, let's say, with like their syntax, right? That's all kind of contributing to one sort of message that they're trying to get, and using the evidence to work together can help you lead to the message, and then that can in turn help you lead to see, okay, how can I incorporate like rhetorical situation and stuff like that. This also works in synthesis, right? They give you multiple sources, use sources together, right? Don't just plop them in isolation. You need to incorporate them with one another ideally. And finally, right, for the argument, that same sort of logic goes. Even though they don't give you the sources, you still should try to incorporate to the best of your ability multiple pieces of evidence together, rather than just treating them as like separate points, right? Make sure your essay has like some coherence. So I keep mentioning this rhetorical situation, right? What am I even talking about, right? The College Board, I just want to emphasize, made a video about it. I hope that exemplifies how truly important the rhetorical situation is. And to sum it up, basically, the way they put it is, you have to ask yourself, when you're reading the rhetorical analysis piece, why is this author making this choice for this specific audience in a specific place and time, right? The sophistication comes from, why are they doing it for this audience in this place and time, right? What about this audience influences their choice? Is the audience hostile? Is it not hostile? How does that influence their choices? Does the audience, or they have a certain nationality or identity? How does that affect the choices, right? A way you can remember this rhetorical situation, the sort of questions you need to ask yourself, is this acronym known as SPACE, okay? So that stands for speaker, purpose, audience, context, and exigence, okay? And by analyzing this question and looking at each choice and saying, okay, how does the speaker's identity impact this? How does their purpose impact this? How's the audience? Why are they choosing this choice for this audience? Why are they choosing it in this context? Why is the exigence pushing them to do this choice? That will help you have a better appreciation for the choices, because yes, the choices themselves help like articulate the message that they want to give, but that message is heightened in the specific context of the work, right? And you may be wondering, why am I saying rhetorical situation for all of these essays? Why do I care about the rhetorical situation for the argument and for the synthesis? But remember, all texts have some sort of context, right? There's some sort of background for every single text you're going to read. And that's why, really, the AP Lang writers, that's why they try to give you the context about the speaker and about the situation in those little, like, sourcings at the top of essays, right? Before you read it, it says, oh, the speaker is they're this person, and this is during this context, right? Use that to your advantage, right? That is your clue about the speaker and the audience, and that will help you highlight limitations and counter arguments and stuff that are arising from the context. So essentially, you need to view the rhetorical situation for these kinds of argumentative essays as a tool to really help you analyze the limitations and the counters and the enhancements. And I know I'm repeating myself, but I truly do think that, in combination with analyzing it in context with other evidence, sets you up really well for sophistication. And really then, the question you need to ask yourself for the synthesis and argument is like, okay, what is the context of this evidence in relation to other pieces of evidence, in relation to the speaker, in relation to the audience? And how does that impact the effectiveness of it? Does it become more or less effective now that I know that the speaker is a social justice worker, or that they're like I don't know, that they're like a company, right? If you've taken APUSH, this is very similar to the sourcing point in APUSH. You can use the same sort of logic if you've heard of the acronym HIPPY. It's the historical situation, the intended audience, the purpose, the point of view, and the why it matters. That sort of thing also applies to AP Lang, right? So finally, our last piece of context here is like truly context, right? Like the speaker and audience, but also this outside evidence, right? What is the situation that this is taking in? What's the place? What's the time? What's the location? How does that impact it, right? That's the, if I go back to rhetorical analysis, that's the context part right here. So notice here I haven't bolded. It's not strictly necessary to gain the sophistication point. I think that if you're highlighting tension, right, if you aren't just using your point of view, if you're highlighting complexity, if you're highlighting multiple different viewpoints, if you're trying to include the rhetorical situation, the context of the work, right, that's usually pretty good for the sophistication point. However, if you want to include outside evidence, that can help you have a even better shot at getting sophistication. So what are some examples of outside evidence? That could be current events. That could be the short-term impacts, the long-term impacts. It can be just anything really that helps provide context for the arguments, right? So one super important thing, I have that in all caps because I want to read it out again. I want to really emphasize it. Outside evidence, if you choose to include it, is more than just a phrase, okay? Sometimes you might think, okay, outside evidence, that'll give me sophistication. I can include the broader context if I just mention it, right? If I just say, oh, this work took place during this time. But that's not enough, right? You need to look at the rhetorical situation. You need to ask yourself, okay, great, it took place during this time. How does that impact the argument? How does that impact the author's choices? Why does that author's specific choice that you're talking about in the evidence, the specific choice, how is that heightened by the context, right? How do current events, how do like modern, I guess, effects or like analogies, how are those related to the argument, right? What do those demonstrate about the argument? So I just want to caution, right, that you don't just include the outside evidence. It's kind of what I was saying before, right, where I keep saying don't just have your evidence in isolation, right? You need to broaden it, right? That's what they're looking for sophistication. They want you to broaden your argument by including context. They want you to broaden your argument by connecting it to other pieces of evidence, right? The rhetorical situation. This is the same thing. Outside evidence is, at the end of the day, just evidence, right? You need to connect it back to your thesis, and you need to explain the logical train of thought as to how does that impact the author's rhetorical choices, or how does that, like, help, like, increase the complexity of your argument? How does that highlight a tension in your argument, right? A broader social thing, potentially. So I want to just go back to this model, and hopefully now that you've watched this, I hope you've watched this whole video, hopefully this makes a lot more sense, right? That sophistication really is, at the end of the day, about making connections. You need to look at the text and say, okay, this piece of evidence, how does it connect to other pieces of evidence, right? How does it connect to other sources? And now those connections, what does that say about the original piece of evidence and about my argument, and about the author's argument, and about the rhetorical choices and the message that the author's saying? How does that contribute, right? Are there any, does it contradict it? Does it help enhance it, right? And I can really be helped by looking at the rhetorical situation too of that connection, of that evidence. Say, okay, well, that's another piece of evidence that is relevant and connects to another piece, like my original piece of evidence, but it also is situated in the context of like the audience, right? And that's another limitation or another enhancement or combination or whatever counter argument that can help, right? Analyzing that space, that speaker, purpose, audience, context, exigence. Super important for rhetorical analysis is looking at the rhetorical situation, but it also applies to your synthesis and your argument, because fundamentally those are argumentative essays. And finally, if you have the time, you can try to include outside evidence, which is really the context of in the rhetorical situation, that sea in space. Just make sure you very directly connect it to your thesis, and ideally it should emphasize kind of the complexity of the situation. So I hope that helps in terms of getting sophistication, thinking about it as not making sure your evidence is not in isolation and that it connects to other pieces of evidence and really just the broader context as a whole. That's what they want to see. Because sophistication for the college board, it's taking your argument to the next level and saying, okay, I'm arguing this, but I understand that there's other viewpoints out there, and I understand that there's more to this than just the text, just the words on a page, right? I understand that there's social context behind this, and there's an audience behind this, and there's a speaker behind this, right? How does the identity of all of those, and how does the fundamental interaction between sources and evidence and all that, how does that make your argument more complex and more multifaceted? I hope, once again, I'm just going to repeat myself, but I hope that helped. I hope this was interesting, and let me know if it does help. Let me know if this is something you've applied in your essay, or if you're an AP Lang teacher, let me know if this is a video you would potentially want to share with your class. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate it. Have a good day.